Hello, everyone. My name is Risa Toha. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale-NUS College in Singapore. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to take part in Politics in Action in 2020 and to share with you some of my updates on developments in politics in Indonesia. Now, 2019 has been an eventful year for Indonesia. I could talk about many things, but for this particular session, I would like to focus on two particular areas. The first one is what can be called as the 2019 presidential election update. And the second one is the section on the challenges that Jokowi has faced in his second term thus far. Now, the 2019 presidential election pitted Jokowi and his longtime rival Prabowo Subianto in a long and bitter campaign. While Jokowi touted his work on expanding Indonesia's infrastructure capacity as his campaign platform, and Prabowo campaigned on economic nationalism, both sides had made frequent and liberal use of appeals to religion to boost their Islamic credentials. The 2019 presidential election had become, among others, a competition of two different ideas of the place of religion in politics. For example, Prabowo accused Jokowi of being a bad Muslim, a Christian, and a communist, and thus unfit to govern Indonesia. On their part, Jokowi's camp had pitched Prabowo's candidacy as a potential threat to Pancasila, democracy, and a secular and tolerant Indonesia. Despite the very divided rhetoric and polarized campaign, however, on the election day itself, things actually went quite smoothly. About 80% of eligible voters turn out to vote, and Jokowi and his running mate Maruf Amin won a comfortable 55% of the total votes, and Prabowo and Sandiaga Uno attained 44% of the total votes. There was almost 17 million vote difference between the winner and the runner-up. Now, despite this broad-based support for Jokowi, almost immediately after the official election results were announced, Prabowo rejected the official results and claimed that there were massive fraud and irregularities. Approximately 1,000 of his supporters gathered in front of the Elections Commission's headquarters. Although the protest was initially peaceful, as night fell, the police began firing tear gas and rubber bullets and water cannon at protesters who had hurled fireworks and rocks at the police and burned police vehicles. Authorities had to shut down major roads and government buildings and block access to social media in order to prevent the further spread of misinformation. About 40,000 police personnel were deployed across the capital. In total, 10 people died, and over 700 people were wounded during the two-day riot. Now, the authorities have indicated that this riot is by no means a spontaneous incident. The mobs were paid, and they were bent on causing chaos. The police even seized an ambulance bearing Prabowo's party, Gerindra, logo carrying rocks, tools, and envelopes stuffed with cash, which the police believed was to be distributed to rioters. Now, the Constitutional Court, after the dust had settled, declared in June 2019 that it had not found any evidence of massive fraud, as Prabowo had claimed in his petition. Now, although this ending to the long saga of the 2019 presidential election brought relief to so many people in Indonesia, this election continued to cast a long shadow on Jokowi's second term in office. He declared for his second term two particular goals. One was reform, and the second one was economic growth. Now, despite these noteworthy goals, Jokowi faced significant challenges. The first of these challenges was that he had to govern a very polarized electorate in the aftermath of the 2019 election. Now, to ensure that his government would not be vulnerable to further challenges from Prabowo and his camp, Jokowi initiated a reconciliation meeting with his former rival and named Prabowo as defense minister in his cabinet. His cabinet also included a collection of party politicians and professionals and can be called by on various dimensions a broad coalitional cabinet. Now, while some have lauded this move as a signal of the president-elect's effort to secure national unity and stability after a very bitter campaign, this attempt to create a broad coalition actually breeds further challenge, which is that Jokowi faces a broad and potentially fragmented coalition. Some have warned that the president's attempts to appease so many different groups of people with conflicting priorities and preferences may actually impede the government's ability to achieve its proposed goals of reform and growth. This desire to accommodate many parties' demands and preferences is reflected in one of the first measures after election. In September 2019, the parliament passed a law that drastically weakened the powers of the country's Anti-Corruption Commission, KPK. The bill requires, among others, the creation of an oversight council which would monitor the Anti-Corruption Commission's performance. The same oversight council would also have the right to give permission to the KPK investigators before investigators can actually conduct wiretaps. Now, while this move may actually put some political elites in Indonesia in great relief, a number of critics and many amongst Indonesian voters have considered this move as a great setback to Indonesia's democratic governance. Now, numerous protests emerged in the aftermath of this bill passing, and yet, despite all of these criticisms and protests, Jokowi did nothing to block the passage of this law. Now, perhaps the biggest challenge and test that the government has faced to date, however, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as of 20th of April, about 6,000 positive cases have been diagnosed in Indonesia, and the death tolls related to COVID-19 had stood at 590. I'm sure the numbers are even greater now. Some scholars have predicted that without stronger interventions, this number would grow up to even 1.5 million positive cases across the country, with more than 140,000 deaths. Now, despite these grim predictions, the government's responses to COVID-19 has at best been viewed as hesitant and uncoordinated. Indonesia was very slow to report positive cases. Even as positive cases were surging in surrounding countries and various authorities began to impose restrictions to quell the spread of the virus, the government of Indonesia maintained that there were no positive cases in the country up until March. As the numbers climbed and calls for greater travel restrictions and regional quarantines were amplified, Indonesia had kept international borders open and instead chose to promote domestic tourism. Now, the decision to bar foreign visitors from entry into the country was not initiated until the end of March. Now, the president has also rejected calls for a national lockdown. Instead, local governments were encouraged to submit requests for approval for the implementation of a large-scale social distancing measures, for the PSBB. Now, in a recent statement, Jokowi suggested why he might have chosen to do so. He encouraged regional governments to consider those whose livelihoods would be affected by these greater restrictions and movements. He said that regional governments should analyze the number of businesses that would not be able to operate during the lockdown and give financial assistance to people who depend on informal economic activities. Those who are very poor and those who work in the informal economy do not have the freedom to work. The government's response to COVID-19 is yet another example that highlights its ambivalence and struggle to accommodate competing demands. The very poor have the choice of either getting sick from COVID-19 or potentially going further and deeper into suffering because of economic damage that the virus imposed. Now, what I hope will become clear in this discussion is that while Jokowi's government was elected with broad-based support in last year's election, the new government continued to struggle with competing demands and priorities from various constituencies. Going forward, as Indonesia has to grapple with COVID-19 and all of its economic and political ramifications, Jokowi would do well to demonstrate a greater coordination and cohesion in his responses, even as he strives to accommodate different demands that come from within and without his government. Thank you very much.